I'm a proponent of free speech. I think you would agree with me there, especially with your background and what you have to do for a living, and my background and what I have to do for a living. We have to be able to speak our minds and have some type of academic freedom in all of this. I teach CEOs, and you teach your section of the United States. So
Yeah,
what?
it's
Go ahead.
ready to go. Yeah, and to me, I would describe it in one word. It's called tolerance.
Yeah, well said. Because what's weird too is like there's a theme going on in the United States. I'm seeing is people in the name of tolerance are being intolerant. And I read a quote this morning from Aldous Huxley. I'm not going to get the quote exactly right, but it's essentially like, if you could create a game where people can be unbelievably cruel and yet think they're actually righteous, you will have the most prolific game. Like, it brings out the absolute worst in humanity. And I've got some theories about why that is, that are going to be unpopular. But I think what we got to do is tackle controversial subjects for each of our audiences. Because what they keep asking me for is, where can we find truth? Because they recognize they can't get it on Fox News, they can't get it on MSNBC, they're not getting it from their politicians. It's, where can they find truth? Because there is no Walter Cronkite anymore. There is no Edward R. Murrow. And I think the most dangerous thing is, there's no defender of the centrist view. All you have is, especially on YouTube or social media, you've got extremes of the left and the right that's so extreme, when really what we're dealing with is a horseshoe of authoritarianism. Like, I don't think the left is really what we have to worry about, or the right is really what we have to worry about. It's authoritarianism, and it seems like it's almost the natural state of mankind. So how can we like cut through the white noise and get to the truth? And my belief is, when we can turn to people like Greg Lukianoff as his finger on the pulse of it, I think that's a step in the right direction. So, like,
Uh,
what? Well, go ahead.
well, first of all, I'm a little disappointed because I thought we were going to talk about how the Dolphins beat the Jets last week, 30-0. But having my perspective when it comes to how news is delivered in two languages, in particular in South Florida, I've noticed one thing. Number one, folks are, if you're tuning into linear, what they call linear television, which is basically saying traditional TV
Yeah.
newscasts, it's more than anything to obtain local news.
Right.
That's what you're looking mostly for. When it comes to national news, to network news, international coverage of conflicts like we're seeing right now in Israel and Gaza, they it's troubling because I do think that you don't have that straight news format, because even on the programs on cable news that are supposed to be straight news, there is some kind of opinion injected into the coverage dependent upon who they choose to analyze or provide, not necessarily the reporter. I'm not specifically saying the journalist, although that could be the case in some circumstances, but the analyst that they bring in, or analysts, sometimes it's more than one, they can present a perspective, and that could be somewhat troubling. The other issue is, of course, how much time you have to explain something. And folks, we're entering into the TikTok era where
Yeah.
most folks, they're getting their information instead of from these traditional news outlets, again, with the exception of local television. I think local television is figuring it out. They honestly are understanding, we, in order to disseminate information, we've got to go more mobile, we've got to go more social media than just on what we have on a screen, because that's changing completely. But at the network level and everything else, I think we have a major challenge with finding truth. And it's immediately, I think the books that we're going to be discussing, or one particular book, it also leads to, when you don't have this one source, a Walter Cronkite, which obviously I was not alive when he was in his prime, but I obviously can look it up, whether it's on YouTube or see other reports. And you can read the historical record. When Walter Cronkite basically soured on the Vietnam War effort, there went public opinion in the United States. I
Yeah.
don't see that one individual today. And it's not meant to, it's not because we have a lack of professional journalists. I am not saying that. In fact, I work with very professional journalists. Again, two stations, two languages, and I do some network coverage for them as well. But it's the world as it is. The world as it is today won't allow for a Walter Cronkite, and your news is not long form; it is short form, and then it's more difficult to find that truth
Yeah.
and what is the fact that we are supposed to be extracting from this and what is not. And it is a very scary time. I think we make it through it because we always have to evolve, but it is a very scary time, and psychologically we all have to understand that we have to do our own. It's our own responsibility to find out, to seek out what that truth is.
Well said. It's almost like what I don't want to do is be guilty of having my news curated for me. It's I want to be a willing
But
participant.
that's what social media does, though. There,
True.
okay. Here's the problem.
Yeah. So
We're meeting people there by putting news through social media formats, but you're curating it yourself. So
well,
that's where the challenges lie.
all right. Let me push back because there's an article by Amanda Ripley called "Complicating the Narrative," and what she talked about is that human beings want simple answers. They want to see who they can blame, that type of thing. Where the truth is much, much more nuanced than that. So the first thing we got to do is we ourselves have to agree that we have to be willing to get into the complication of that narrative. And that's what I mean by not having our news curated for us. So this way we're willing participants in our own research. Because I think what's really the challenge here is that we have access to research tools that's never existed in the world ever before. Yet we don't know how to research. So this is the line I use when I present to my CEOs is we're born bad lawyers, and then we decide way too quickly which side of the argument we're on, and then we seek only the first evidence that proves our side of the argument correct. It's a special type of stupid right there, which we're all guilty of because we're all human beings. The part that I'm not willing to participate in is that a lot of places lie to us and tell us that our worldview is correct when our worldview is incorrect. Like, my background with evolutionary theory, and my most recent book is on why we're so politically divided. But the real truth of it is that in our ancestors' day, they didn't even know there was a globe. So when we hear global threat statistics, we actually misinterpret them on a small village level, significantly inflating that threat. And then people use that tendency in us to manipulate us, just like the casinos do. Like we didn't know that we never dealt with precision gambling devices in our ancestral past. You looked at the weather and if it rains 7 days in a row, what's the likelihood it's going to rain the eighth day? Is not high. So if black comes up on roulette 13 times in a row, what's the chances of? It's exactly the same as it was the previous. I don't even know what you call it, the swivel of the roulette wheel, right? So we don't know that because we're not educated that way. So we're educated in a way to eliminate illiteracy. We're not educated to eliminate innumeracy. So what I want to do with this podcast is I want to get in the weeds with these authors because my belief is the best place for us to find truth is from authors. And the reason why, especially PhDs, even though Lukianov is not a PhD, he's touching on something that PhDs need to turn their attention to, and a lot of them don't know it actually exists, and that's cancel culture, or what somebody who leans the opposite direction would call it accountability culture. When I'm not so sure it's really about accountability, it's about self righteousness and being cruel. That's really what it's about. And then, so I see it as a dangerous thing for a host of things, not the least of which is politics, which is your world, or economics, which is mine.
I, I I agree with you, and whether you call it accountability, whether you call it cancel culture, however you want to label it, the fact is it's about tolerance.
Yeah.
Okay, especially yes, I have a background in politics. I worked in eight, nine different countries in a 4-year period, not counting the United States, with a major firm, and we basically put together political campaigns for presidents, prime ministers, party coalitions, mostly in Latin America and the Western Hemisphere, but also some in the Middle East. And I have had to learn how it is that different messages are disseminated in different environments. But I will tell you that it's all about tolerance if you're going to function as a society. because just because somebody says something you don't like doesn't mean that you are supposed to just turn off, shut down, and not engage with them. I think we see that here in Florida. We've kind of been ground zero for these culture wars about what is taught in classrooms and what is not.
Yeah, that's true.
But the reality is that whether it's in the news business that I'm also in, whether it's in the political campaign trail, you have to accept that in a country or you could even go to your specific community, wherever that may be, there's diversity in the United States.
Yep.
There's diversity of thought, there's diversity of economy. In other words, what you do for a living, which really shapes up a lot of your perspectives.
Hell yeah.
And when you don't when you label somebody a lefty, a righty, a canceller, uh, agnostic, maybe just not caring, et cetera, et cetera, it's too easy. It becomes just too easy to shut them down, and that's where I think Lukianoff and others. Notice if you read his actual book, this is more to the viewers. You've obviously read it a couple of times, but you see that he's even making the case that he has defended the kind of speech that he doesn't
Yep.
necessarily agree with. He
Yep.
doesn't agree with the opinion. And
Hmm.
nor does he say free speech is yelling fire in a crowded theater. He's not saying that either. He's simply saying there are certain comments that need to be respected. There are certain offhand jokes which land wrong, but that doesn't mean you eliminate or end someone's 30-year career because of one bad joke. And we've seen a lot of that. Um, I'm certainly not a national figure, but at the local level, I've received messages when I say I analyze a political situation the way that I did on, for example, on just after the 2020 election, where I said, ultimately, what happened tonight. This was on January 6th. We still had COVID restrictions, so I was analyzing from my backyard with a TV camera. And yes, if people follow me on Instagram, I really do the interviews with a shirt, a jacket, a tie, and gym shorts, because you never see below my waist. But I was back there and I said, look, regardless what happened today in the Capitol, which will get sorted out, they're going to come back. They're going to certify the election. You're going to have Biden come in on January 20th. And the amount of messages that I received on my private accounts saying that just wasn't true, that I was a liar, that I was this, that, that was an opportunity for me to say, okay, that is still their speech. They are still able to say that.
Yeah.
So I didn't attack in response. I didn't respond to many of the messages, but it was basically, this is the US system of government and it will proceed as such. And yes, at 4 a.m., they came back, they certified the election, it was over. But those are the types of issues that I have had where but some of the folks in our newsroom, they are wrong. Yeah, they're wrong, but I'm not going to tell them, don't tell me that. You're
Yeah.
allowed to have that perspective.
Yeah.
You're allowed to think that. And we're getting to a point, I think, in other parts of the country, and I have the book here. Certainly throughout the book, he gives examples where they disagreed with something that was said or how it was said, or there was one individual out of hundreds or even thousands who were offended, and these groups just go to cancel the individual, go to eliminate them.
Yeah.
That, in my view, is just wrong, and it's not something that should be tolerated. It should be pushed back against. I really do think Lukianoff is doing good work, because you don't have to agree with your neighbor, your coworker, but you have to tolerate that they have a perspective. And we're seeing that's not the case even when you look at network news, and the way that folks consume their cable news. It is we're not broadcasting anymore. The term is narrowcasting. You're
Yeah, yeah.
finding your
Makes
group,
sense. That makes sense. Okay, so let's
and
let's
that's
build,
a concern.
let's build a background for Lukianoff. Right, he came onto my radar screen in 2018 when he co-authored the book "The Coddling of the American Mind" with Jonathan Haidt. And Jonathan Haidt has 3 books that are worthy of reading. The first is called "The Happiness Hypothesis," where he outlines something called the difference between the rider and the elephant, about kind of his version of how the mind works as a moral psychologist, right? So but he really got my attention with "The Righteous Mind," So the righteous mind is all about why people are politically divided on religion and politics. Why are we so left and right and those type of things? Brilliant book. In my estimation, though, it's missing one thing. It's missing the work of Isaiah Berlin. When we cover that book, we'll get into the weeds on it. In the meantime, though, Lukianov ran into him, I think, in the Village in Manhattan, and they kind of knew of each other. And Lukianov approached him and said, "Look, I'm noticing something going on with college students." And him, Haidt being a professor at the time, noticed it too. That right around 2014, the battle for free speech switched sides. The students used to be 100% behind free speech. They wanted it. In kind of classic anti-Vietnam protests from the '60s, all that type of stuff, right? So, well, what happens is Lukianov approaches him and says, social media is doing something. And now the students are demanding speech codes because they're perceiving words as violence. So they're demanding trigger warnings, to demanding that professors not be allowed to bring up anything that could potentially offend them, and then starting to try to get them fired for doing so. And like I just went through his stuff again this morning before we did the podcast, and he talked about, because I was curious about why FIRE, the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression that Lukianov runs, why did they only cover 256 universities on their kind of watchdog list for the worst of the universities against free speech? Harvard being number one, which is kind of shocking to me. Virtually all of the Ivy Leagues are in the bottom 10%. It's almost proportional to how elite the university is. That's how bad everything is. But I was curious why I only covered 256 and not all of them. Because if you were to Google it right now, you're looking at probably somewhere in the neighborhood of 4,000 colleges. So it turns out, he clarified it in a recent interview, 80% of all students go to 600 colleges. And it's like some crazy number like that. So it's kind of a factoring effect. And what happens is that what we got to do is keep an eye on them, because the number of professors being sanctioned or punished for what would have been covered under academic freedom in the past, we're in the thousands. In fact, there's something like 1/6 of all professors have been sanctioned in some way, shape, or form. 200 have been outright fired or tenured. 2/3 of them have been somehow punished in some way, shape, or form. And that's not about learning. That's actually the opposite. To me, when a student demands that a professor not be allowed to bring up anything that could potentially offend them, that's a special type of stupid right there. That is
Well,
anti-learning.
it is. And by the way, I just want to point out, you could find it on page 321 of Canceling the American Mind, number 28 in universities. That's slightly above average in terms of speech is Florida International University, my alma mater, where I earned my
shameless,
2 degrees.
shameless self
Um,
promotion.
just saying,
Congratulations.
I'm also an adjunct professor there, in the school for politics. But the challenge that I see here is, yes, you're absolutely right. I haven't experienced it with my students, but I teach smaller classes. I teach them online. But you
Can,
know,
can I interrupt you for a second there? Because
yeah,
I want to ask you some questions about that, right?
go
Because
ahead.
I got a nagging suspicion this is not as bad at state universities than it is at the private universities. I think that if the students are commuters, it's not as bad. If the students are somehow still have a foot on the ground in reality before they walk into this la la land that is an elite university that's where you're away. So I think there's the difference, because the students who are go to state college are a commuter. They're faced with reality on a daily basis. They can't get detached from reality. What's your thoughts on that?
Well, first, I want to say that FIU is probably, I have a suspicion that it's what most major universities are either becoming or will become into the future, because there is, first of all, it's incredibly diverse. It's about 65% minority. Most of that minority group is Hispanic, but obviously they welcome them from all over the world. I think it's somewhere around 80 countries students come from. So it is a very interesting dynamic, because they're first generation. Many of them are first generation. I think it was above a quarter of the last academic year's enrollment were first generation in their family to attend college. Most of them work. and I'm not saying a job 10 hours a week down the street at the restaurant. I'm saying 40 hours a week. Average age is slightly above the 18 to 22 that you would expect in college for undergrads. It's actually a little, I have to get the latest number, but it should be around 23, 24 average age. And that to me shows there's a little bit more maturity,
Hmm.
because if you're having to work through college full time, if your parents came from some other country, you may have been born here, but you're the first in the family to attend, maybe you're a first generation American. Um, there are differences in how you approach your academic experience. And we try to implement what's called it's called finish in four. We want students getting in, having going into a field, learning in a degree that is actionable, that you're walking out and you're employable right away. And so I haven't confronted that kind of "you're offending me, professor," with even going into certain topics.
Yeah.
And that could be the case because, I mean, I'm in the School of International Public Affairs. We deal with different issues every week where we just have conversations like we're having now, and I get into, well, this is going on, what are your thoughts on it? And the number one rule with my students is we listen to everyone. We're not rude, we're respectful to one another, whether you're writing on a forum or you're exchanging here on this Zoom. But I would have to agree with you that state universities are different in that, from that perspective, because of the fact that the student experience is very different. And it is in a metropolitan area like Miami. Um, you can't help but have a diversity of opinion. You just can't. It's very, very different from the rest of the country because of, well, number one, it's a relatively young community, but it's waves of immigrants that have come in and just have a completely different perspective. And they left, many of these students, they come from families that left countries because they weren't permitted to express their opinion or move forward economically. And they just have different perspectives. I would say that's probably the case. I've only taught at FIU, but I'd say that's probably the case with state universities across the country.
Yeah, it seems to be like more coming from the middle class as opposed to the elites. Because it does strike me odd that, a lot of the students at these universities come back as what um, what Lukianov calls fundamental social justice warriors, right? Which is actually a form of a religion. Which, if I understand correctly, Vivek, if I'm pronouncing his last name correctly, Ramaswamy, who's running for president this year, he talks about how this shouldn't be allowed in the states. So it's separation from church and state, which I would imagine that's going to be thorny to actually legislate. But the idea here is that there are hallmarks to this as a religion, and that people are almost like born offended. Like, so I've had to take in the last 2 years to right before I start to speak to my CEOs. Well, for those who don't know, I teach about 4,200 CEOs a year, mostly in the private sector, in a thing called a peer advisory board across the United States. I'm in like 52 cities a year, but I've had to turn to everyone and say, look, what I'm about to teach you is an equal opportunity offender, because I teach them about evolution and the science of human nature so they can predict the future more accurately. Because it turns out human beings are really boring, right? And the beauty of boring is you bake that into your strategic planning, your marketing planning, your investment planning, all those plans become more durable and more sustainable. Like, people aren't going to change anytime soon for certain characteristics, right? So that at least you know the knowable future. But because I actually have to tell people that biology exists, a healthy portion of my audiences get offended by that. So offended, one in Vegas is trying to get me fired right now as we speak. So the what I've had to do is ask for a hands commitment in the air that I will be unoffendable for the duration of this presentation, and I don't start speaking until all the hands go up in the air. I say, okay, now I'm going to do my best to
Yeah.
offend everybody in the room. I mean, this is
See,
ridiculous. I
see,
have to do that,
that's
but
the difference. That's the difference between what you and I do, because when I don't see who I'm talking to on television, I know I offend a lot of the audience, but it's not on purpose. It's just, this is my perspective and analysis. But yeah, I agree. Um, and you would have a different perspective being in those rooms with the CEOs of 4,200 of them. But I just feel that it's what we're seeing now is being driven the offended population, I do feel it's being driven from the younger generations of Americans, and I worry about that. I do. I have two small children, two young children. They're 11 and 8. Um, I want them to be. Remember, my first word when we started this podcast was tolerance. I want my kids to be resilient, and resilient is part of being resilient is you have to be tolerant of other people's perspectives. You know, I normally wouldn't speak to a Jets fan. I'm kidding. No, I'm saying you have to be resilient in life by being able to say not everyone. I know we talk a lot about books. I'm very much into stoicism, and it's almost like you wake up in the morning and you say to yourself, I'm going to meet rude people. I'm going to work with clients that are pains in the ass. I'm going to do this. I'm going to do that. I'm going to encounter all of these uncomfortable moments,
Yeah.
but I have to go through it because
Yeah.
that's human existence. And I can't be offended. I would add, I mean, some of the Stoics wrote 2,000 years ago. I can't be offended at everything that is said. I actually have to be able to say, whether it's across a business discussion in a boardroom somewhere, I have to be able to say, okay, look, that's their perspective.
Yep.
But if the more offended we get, whether it's politics or in a classroom, talk about a threat to not just democracy but commerce.
Absolutely.
Okay, you got to be able to do business with folks. If you're looking at the commerce side, at the economic side, you have to be able to do business with folks that you don't necessarily agree with. And in politics, hell, that's the name of the game. You're compromising at every single turn, whether you're voting, like my city commissioners over here are voting on whether or not to approve the construction of a new police department, or hey, should we put a stop sign on the corner? Or in Congress, whether or not they're going to do something about our crisis at the border or Ukrainian and Israeli funding. So
Well,
there's a lot that goes into it.
well, all right. So let me add some fuel to the fire there, and this is going to be a little controversial. All right, what I'm noticing out there in the trends is not just young people. Well, first of all, millennials seem to like this a lot better than Gen Z. Gen Z's dealt too much too long with the negativity of it. Maybe they've even been exposed to the negativity side for themselves, so they really don't like it. What who seem to really like it are the millennials. So they're starting to creep into my world. They're becoming CEOs. Now in my world, the way things break down is it's probably 80 to 90% male. You know, men are willing to work like maniacs for money. Women don't seem to gravitate towards that as much. So the whole concept that there's some barrier out there protecting, blocking women from these positions is not actually correct. Not, it doesn't stand up to scrutiny. In fact, that's going to be a book that we're gonna definitely tackle. Although I do have to warn you, if you haven't gotten yelled at by the White House yet, you're gonna be after that one. So and that I know they do call
Well,
you, and
and
I know they get upset with you. The idea though is we
I
can't we
actually,
can't murder truth. You know.
and I actually am. I checked. I had to verify this, but I actually am a millennial. Believe it or not, because depending upon when you say it started, the generation started. I was born in September of '82. So I technically qualify as a millennial. Um, and yes, I do receive calls from folks in Washington. Look, controversial conversation should be welcome. I mean, everything that's discussed coming out of the White House is controversial.
Yeah.
Um, but millennials
There's
are
one
what,
thing
the
though.
middle agers.
The okay, so by my definition, so I wrote a book on this. My first one's called Meta Trends in the Next Economy. So I moved the start of Gen X to to reflect the dearth, because it was really originally it was called the Forgotten Generation, and it starts with the advent of the ubiquity of the pill and legalized abortion. So that ended up making sure that a lot of people weren't born. So right after the baby boom peaks in 1962 and it troughs in 74. So you're definitely a millennial. The difference, though, I do have to give you a compliment about that. And I'm not trying to beat up millennials here. It's just you don't tend to think like a millennial. You're like more like an extension of the boomers and at least based on my
The
opinion, the conversations we've had so
yeah,
far.
because I kind of share characteristics of both, and I was
Yeah.
also born to I was born. What? Wait, my parents. I don't. My mom doesn't want me to say her age, but hypothetically, if they were born in the mid 50s, uh, that would make them still boomers because boomers used to have went to 62 ish.
62, yeah. And
Yes.
I changed the definition of it mainly because, when demographers decide on what to name a generation, it never sticks. So whatever happens later on to them when they come of age, that's why millennials are called millennials, because they came of age at the millennial.
Yeah. When I
And my
graduated high
parents,
school.
and there's also I don't want to go in the weeds on that now. We can do this on a different video, but the argument here is this is the real controversial thing. It's not really males. It's the females are getting offended by tons of things. So when I actually present, 1/10 of 1% of my male populations get upset at my presentation. 1/10 of 1%. 7% of females get upset at my presentation. And it's proportional if the chair is female, who's the person that organizes the whole thing, and at least one of the members classifies themselves as a feminist. They're offended from word go, no matter what I do. And those are the ones that try to get me fired. So this is something I think that we have to address. We can't just take a look at this in a vacuum and say, okay, this is just this age group. It's this age group, and it's mostly white women. And I think the reason why is this is probably the most important thing I tripped over just recently. There's concepts out there called peacocking when you're trying to establish where you are within your tribe. One anthropologist actually makes a really strong argument that the reason why we evolved language was so that we could lie and try to navigate a higher status in our in group. Those are usually done conspicuously, like conspicuous consumption. Like, why do men drive supercars? They don't necessarily know this consciously, but subconsciously, they're sending a message to the world. This is an honest display of how many resources I have. I can afford a $300,000 car. How many men can do that? The pernicious part of that isn't that. Like, that's going to be with us forever. The pernicious part is this new thing called conspicuous outrage. What are you offended by? And that somehow means I'm a better person than you if I'm offended by X, Y, or Z and you're not. You see what I'm saying?
But wouldn't you call that also a form of virtue signaling?
Without a doubt. So, and it's so dishonest, yet it actually makes them feel better about themselves, so they can be cruel while feeling righteous. And when you combine those two things, I mean, that's what caused the Red Scare. That's what caused the purges, the pogroms, so many things throughout the 20th century. You could argue that little concept out there of how I can self-righteously be cruel killed as many people over 57 years as smallpox and malaria did. 160 million human beings. So that goes back to authoritarianism, and we got to be really careful about that. Because my wife made me watch Schindler's List about 6 months ago. I refused to watch it because when you study atrocities, you don't want to sit down with a scotch in your hand to sit down and watch one on the movies, because the movies get things wrong on purpose in most cases. I look for documentaries for that sort of thing. And because the real dangerous thing is, although Schindler's List is one of the best movies that's ever been made, I mean, Spielberg's up there with the pantheon of movie makers. The downside is it's really easy for us to convince ourselves we would have been one of the good guys. And that's not the truth. Because what the evolutionists would argue is, no, genocide is so common throughout history, human beings are naturally genocidal. So what we have to do is actually spot that earlier in our culture so we can eradicate it. That's what I think Luciano's onto. So
Yeah, in other words, a tolerance of diversity of opinion.
there you go.
Also, but there's something else here. That I don't know if he uses it in the book. I've kind of been thumbing through it because I have lots of notes in there.
Uh-huh.
Um, but it's also about also accepting that you have to forgive people if they make a statement that it may, whether it offends you, whether it's untrue, whatever it can be. The fact is, people have bad days and they may make a mistake and they may say something that maybe an off-color joke. Whatever it may be, but you don't judge the totality of their professional career, their life, their soul based on one mistake. And I do feel, especially now, politicians take advantage of that all the time.
Yep.
And it's unfortunate because politicians are a reflection of our society. At the end of the day, we put them in office. Bottom line.
You are correct.
And if we don't have more tolerance, and I think in politics, tolerance, or the example of tolerance, is bipartisanship. And I will say, I know we talk a lot about doom and gloom. I see a lot of bipartisanship in Washington over the last 3 years. Even towards the tail end of the Trump administration, we did have a lot of tolerance and bipartisanship, especially when it came to the COVID emergency. And I'm not referring to whether to get vaccinated or not. I'm not referring to that. I'm referring to the legislative packages that were approved in a split Congress in 2020, in 2021, 22, and now heading into 23. There is some hope there. But you're right, in the sense that this idea that Mark offended me with what he just said. And I'm not just going to cancel Mark. I'm going to like personally cancel him. Like he and I are no longer going to be Facebook friends, or actually Facebook is for old people now. Apparently, I was told by my daughter it's more for, the older folks, and TikTok is where it's at. But the it's not just that I'm going to do that personally. It's that I am going to talk to my friends. I'm going to speak with my friends, and I'm going to do everything I can to make sure that they and everyone else eliminate Mark from here. And that's not necessarily right. There's one thing that have consumer, because I was talking about this. There's consumer behavior, right? Okay, I don't want to buy X because I don't like the product.
Yeah.
That's different.
That's different.
Not, I am not shopping here because there was one issue with Target. I believe it was recently. I'm not shopping here because they do this. Well, I think that's just the organization saying we are tolerant, we're respectful, we celebrate everybody. You may not like it. That's okay. But ultimately, this push to maybe cancel them or others, I just think it's yes, anti-American, but it's also not smart. It's not economically intelligent. It's not politically intelligent. And the more we, if anything, the call out culture should be to call out the call outers.
Yes.
And say, hey, take a step back. Okay. Like, they're allowed to do what they're allowed to conduct business as they would like. They're allowed to, you don't have to shop there, but it doesn't mean you have to go try and destroy a company, which, by the way, when you're trying to destroy a company, you know what you're doing. They have employees that have families, And so I think it is a good, I think Luciano's doing, he's doing good work. I haven't had a chance to reread the book, but I do think it addresses a major issue. By the way, a lot of folks are saying that this is a lefty political issue. He's got quotes in here from former President Barack Obama, hardly a conservative, very progressive president, and yet he's calling out cancel culture and or accountability culture, whatever they want to call it, on how damaging it can be. So it's critical that we understand that across the political spectrum, we're not doing ourselves any favor by accepting this. The political spectrum is saying, hey, this is actually damaging to our country.
Okay, so there's two things I want to get into. One is I want to give Ricky Schlott her kudos too. Now she's a 23-year-old, so she's not a graduate from NYU. She dropped out because she couldn't deal with the indoctrination camp that it's becoming. Right, again, the elite universities.
Co-author of Canceling the American Mind.
Right, and co-authoring a book like this at 23 years old. Do you remember what you were doing at 23 years old? I was a dope.
Not authoring a book.
Totally, right?
I was trying to skate by and finish my undergraduate degrees and hopefully be employable.
Yeah,
23 years old.
I was doing my 5th year of college to get a 4-year degree because I partied at least one of those years, So
that's understandable. But yeah, I understand exactly what you're saying in terms of she has taken on this role and worked diligently to document these examples throughout the book.
Yeah.
And contribute in a meaningful way.
She also does the audiobook, so it's her voice. But more importantly than that, it was something that she said in an interview. Because what I did for the research for this podcast was I went back and watched each one of them be interviewed by different people numerous times over the last few weeks while we were preparing for this. So in one of them, she talked about how in her dorm, she was the only girl that did not have self-harming scars. Every one of the other girls did, and that's something that we need to take a look at here, because teenage female suicide rates are the highest they've ever been. They're up 75% in the last 6 years, and that's social media. So there's a whole thing in here about female aggression versus male aggression. Right, male aggression, like you and I, we say something wrong to each other, we're going to knock each other's teeth out, and the reason why we don't step out of line is because it's perfectly socially acceptable for us to knock each other's teeth out. You're a little bigger than me, so if you started the fist fight, it'd be dishonorable on your part. If I did, it would just be stupid. You know what I mean? The situation, though, is women do not have their aggression show up that way. How it shows up is reputation, savaging, innuendo, and gossip. So what they do is people like, and if you look at it, now this is something that Jordan Peterson said in his interview with Greg Lukianoff and Ricky Schlott. He talked about how female aggression shows up in these things, that we're seeing the university system become female centric. And the argument is that he argues, which I think is a pretty salient point, that women who are childless will find, um, what would you call it? They will white knight for other people who are outside the room. And what they'll do is
Right.
they'll try to protect them. And I think it goes back to a great question he asked, but he didn't ask it this way. When does parenting go too far? Now I know you got young kids. My youngest is 18, so I recognize parenting goes too far when you're trying to protect them from their own stupidity. They have to fail, right? So like I had a situation where my youngest
They
was,
have to, because that makes them resilient.
that was without a doubt. So my youngest was trying to help us build a patio in the backyard, and I was using something called a hand tamper. Like you can buy the powered ones. I just said, "Hey, I got 4 sons. Like they got to be useful for something, right? Let's have them help me build the patio, right?" So the now he's got the thing. He's got the hand tamper, which is sticking out like no exaggeration, Mike, 4 feet past his head, and but he's got it cocked to the side. And I know this is going to go bad, but I said, maybe this is a life lesson. So he slams the thing down. It goes like this, whacks him in the side of the head, and now he's crying. And he's crying, he's crying, he's crying. He's crying for a while. And I said, did that hurt your vagina? And man, it was like the tears like sucked up back into his face. And he just glared at me. He's like, I forgot what an asshole you are. I'm like, but now you remember. Think of the benefits. And then he started to cry again. He goes, no, don't you see this really hurt my ear? And like, okay, it was a little swollen, it was a little red. But he was a bit of a mama's boy back then. Like wanted everything to go his way, that kind of stuff. And I said to him, I said, those movies you love, like the Avengers, like like Captain America and Thor and the Hulk,
Iron Man.
Iron Man, all that stuff. I said they have 3 things in common: they're big, they're strong, and and he said tough. And I said, and you're only ever going to be as big as you're going to be. Probably not that big because you're my son, right? You're not going to be all that tough either because you're my son. Genetics are genetics, but you can toughen up. That's like a buildable skill. So, and it's one of the things that you need. Like, in fact, what we had was we were going back and forth for a little while there. He had this host of friends that he ended up brooming, but for about a year there, they were really like not nice people. And so he'd bring them over to our house, my house, or my ex-wife's house, and they'd kind of eat us out of house and home, drink all our food, party in our living room. They would not make eye contact with adults. They would not say please, hello, or thank you. And then he told me that they all had these like code names for their pronouns. And I was like, okay, this is right when pronouns first started becoming a thing. And I said, okay, so what's what's that person? And he'd say like, oh, that's they, them, dad. And it's disrespectful if you don't honor their pronouns. And I said to him, you mean the kids that come in here and don't say hello to me, don't make eye contact, don't say please, and don't say thank you? I got to respect their pronouns. And he was like, yeah. I said, how about we just make a shortcut? I said, what if we just call them all one thing that they're all likely to be instead of using their pronouns? And he said, what's that? I said, unemployable. So you got to raise kids to
I
be employable.
that's it's an interesting aspect of the conversation, because in the university setting we obviously offer the student to be identified as they would like to be. And I respect that. I haven't had many requests. What I normally do is just call them by their names, because they're in a class, they're a student. I need to grade them. I'm not grading they, them, whatever. I'm grading Mark Prot.
Yeah.
So I haven't tried to be offensive that way, but what I do think is respect is a two-way street. If I am to respect whatever you would like me to address you as, I also think you got to make eye contact with me if I'm the parent of the house as you were and you're walking into my house. Real
Exactly.
quick though, I want to. I found here, Canceling American Mind, page 55. This is why I'm looking down. I this one section of the op-ed that Ricky wrote. If we can't discuss touchy subjects and wrestle with controversial ideas on campuses, where can we? We come to college to ask the unaskable and answer the unanswerable questions of our time. Sometimes that means we might express something inartfully, or, yes, sometimes offensively. But discussion, debate, and resolution are the remedies to that tension. Okay, page 55, Canceling of American Mind. And that to me is, news. Okay, whether it's the newsroom when I'm sitting there and I do, like I said, I have two stations, right? So the NBC station, I'm speaking to an English speaking audience. Most of them have a general understanding of what I'm analyzing, which is politics. On the Spanish language station, Telemundo, I'm analyzing what is, for some folks that arrived less than a year ago in the United States, what the US political system is or what the local government is, etc. And so yes, I'm speaking two languages about the same subject, but I'm presenting the information in very different ways. But if I am not able to say, this is what the Republicans are saying, this is what the Democrats are saying, this is what government has been and what has usually resulted in these types of circumstances, uh, and I can't do it on a news channel that is supposed to be straight down the middle and just presenting facts, then we're in deep trouble. That's why I keep going back to the original point I made when we started this thing. Local news is
Yes.
still very successful because it's localized and it's talking about issues that are nearest and dearest to you. They have to make changes and adjustments, but we have to be able to take on those issues, analyze them, present them, and then have viewer to newsroom interaction. But this idea that whether it's a university, television, your podcast, your Vistage, your talks, which one day I may be privileged enough to be welcome into one of those group meetings. I just want to be there one time, see how many people you offend. I'm
Yeah.
going to
Just
take notes.
don't bring up the
Um,
Dolphins.
it, but what I would say is, we have to have the free exchange of ideas. How else are we going to get over this? We have to break the fever. We're right now. I think it's a national fever.
Yes.
It's hotter in some areas than it's
Yes.
warmer in some areas than others. I like we mentioned the differences between state universities and the more elite institutions by per rankings, but it still exists, right? And you have to address it. You have to be able to address the fact that we have to toughen up. To your point, to your son, you have to be able to toughen up and say, I can still tolerate you even if I find your views somewhat offensive or completely offensive. But in the real world, especially to college students who may be watching this, and I say this in my courses, you could ask any of the students I've taught over the last 5 years. In the real world, you're going to have to do business, work for, work with, work in any kind of setting on a team project with people that you disagree with people that you may find offensive.
If I may
And
jump in here on that, what I think is that the trend I'm seeing is that when the HR department at corporations are running everything, nothing will be run right, including HR. So there's a way that you can actually win over HR to get them to help you weed out narcissists as opposed to making the narcissist right. So it really comes down to this very simple phrase. Every once in a while, I run into a chair who typically is like picture a white haired person that had their liquidity event, sold their company for millions and millions, and want to stay sharp and give back. It's very collegial, it's very like professorial. They don't do all the teaching, but they make sure that the person's thinking about the world in the right way. Every once in a while, I'll run into one of them that wants me to make their member right. And I'm like, no, 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 no. Making people right is wrong. Making people wrong is wrong. It's how do we make them win? So every once in a while, they're going to have an incorrect worldview. In fact, this is one of the things I've been wrestling with, and maybe we'll do a video on this one, is how do you tell a person their feelings are wrong? Now, it's like, let's say I insult you, I goof on the Dolphins or you goof on the Jets or whatever. The deal is that if you feel bad about that, okay, I understand it, but maybe not between me and you and not between sports fans because we know we're just goofing around. Like I got a couple of stories about that. Like picture I was in the Meadowlands in 2001, and we were it was in December. We were freezing our asses off watching the Jets lose, and I just turned to my buddies and I said, I just did the mental math. I think it takes less time to get home from Miami than it does to get out of the parking lot after the game in the Meadowlands. And all my buds kind of looked at me and they said, "Let's do it." So for this would be our 19th game total this next year. So we've done 18 total games, interrupted because of COVID and a couple other minor things. But we did 18 games on the road. We've seen 5 total wins, right? The first loss was the game where Chad Pennington replaced Vinny Testaverde in Miami. And picture it's me in my Joe Namath jersey being harangued by about 45 Dolphin fans that's chanting JETS sucks, 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 right? And I'm not even fighting back. I'm just looking at my shoes and they're going off for like 20 minutes because they beat us like 46-3, right? It was like beating up your little sister's team. It wasn't like dishonorable after a certain point, right? So they're haranguing me, and finally I looked up at them and I said, I wish I could argue with you guys. And then it turned into like this group therapy thing. They're like slapped me on the back, like, "Don't worry, buddy, we used to suck too." So, and I got to tell you, being a Jet fan is character building. Like I know I'm not entitled to nice things. It prepared me for COVID. God is not a Jet fan. I need to have low to no expectations. When Aaron Rodgers got hurt and blew out his Achilles, I was proven right in my assumptions that he was going to hurt himself, go to the Hall of Fame, and we were going to end up 8-9 anyway. So that's likely what we're going to be. I look prophetic, and I was making that
Yeah,
claim
I
in
mean,
June.
being a Doll fan is, I would have to say, equally painful. We haven't won a Super Bowl since the '73 season. That was 9 years before I was born. And we haven't been back to the Super Bowl since I think Marino's second year. Dan Marino's been retired for 22 years.
Yep.
So it's been a while, but it is, it's a good metaphor. It's a good way to say, look, life is tough, and part of that difficulty in business, or if you're in a university where you're basically trying to find out who you are at that young
What's that?
age, you have to be exposed to a diversity of opinion, because sometimes it's even in politics. I'll tell you this, in politics, um, you sometimes you're not sometimes, the majority of the time nowadays, sadly, you're not speaking to you're not listening to understand. You're listening to just be able to come back with your talking point, with your issue. But the reality is we don't even present information to one another the way that we should. The information, so the setting the table, the foundation of the discussions, okay, are we just don't agree on the terms. We just don't agree on identifying what the issue is. And I use this example at all times. It's well, we had this government issue in Congress where it's, we they have to, the some of my friends there at the station were saying, the Republicans are shouldn't cave to the Democrats. The Democrats are spending too much money, and they gotta just, even if it means shutting down the government. I said, let me explain to you 2 reasons why I don't think they're going to shut down. Number one, I think that they know how to count, because both sides have to swallow something that they don't want to swallow,
Yeah, that's
but they have to
negotiation.
count to a certain number, okay, to get a bipartisan vote, because guess what our Congress is right now? Divided. You have a Democratic Senate, a Republican House. I said, so if they're going to go on a party line vote, you're right, they will close. But if they go bipartisan, they're going to keep the government open. So one, they can count. Two, no one wants to be blamed for certain government services going they're not operating during the shutdown, or delays in receiving social security checks or other payments of government assistance. And the bottom line is that you have to learn how to negotiate, how to tolerate other people's perspectives. And if our university system across the country, colleges and universities, are becoming less tolerant, more sensitive to potential offending, okay, talk about a problem for future generations here in the United States, because then they're learning at a young age to shield themselves, and this goes for the right and the left and everything in between. They're shielding themselves, they're protecting themselves from being exposed to something that may be offensive. So we have to have the conversations a lot less like Washington is doing right now, and cable news is doing, and just basically agree on a certain set of facts. Number one, you're not going to agree with me all the time. I'm not going to be agree in agreement with you all the time. But the fact of the matter is, I don't think you're a bad person trying to harm me, and I am certainly not trying to harm you. And we could coexist. I don't know if my neighbors. I have a couple of Jets fans in my neighborhoods, because you New Yorkers always find your way to move to South Florida. But
Yeah.
it doesn't matter. The point, I know it's a joke in the term in sports terms, but there are neighbors around here that are Republicans, that are Democrats, and the fact is that we coexist because we all just want to live in a peaceful neighborhood, raise our children, or in some of their cases, raise their grandchildren that come over and visit. And if we don't set the table, set the foundation correctly when we're in colleges and universities, and maybe even younger, I'll find out when my son goes to middle school next year, then we got a problem. We got a more serious problem, because they're the future. I know millennials are now starting to get into the C-suites across the country. If the generations that are coming after them aren't tolerant, aren't accepting of different perspectives, then that we will have a problem internally within our economy, within the future of leadership in this country, politically. Also, folks are going to get elected from those generations very soon.
Well, I think what you're alluding to is probably the basis of another podcast. So it's a concept in evolutionary theory called displaced religiosity. So the concept is, now we need much more time to go into it. I won't end on this. Like I'll just give a little brief thing, maybe a teaser for the next one. The argument here is that Blaise Pascal was right when he argued that every human being has a God-shaped hole in his or her heart. Now, he was religious. He was trying to prove God exists through math. A lot of science in the early days of science was about trying to prove God exists through their chosen field. What he argued was that so God could fill that hole. So, what an evolutionist would say is, no, it's because it enabled our ancestors to live long enough to procreate. And whatever that happens to do, whatever that characteristic that is, whether it's a characteristic, a mutation, gene, some type of social structure, that we're all descendants of successful procreators. So whatever increases that successful procreation continues in the next generation. So
But
what
but
the
does he go on to Darwinism, in other words?
yeah, so what happens is, well, it depends on who you're talking to, but the argument from the Darwinistic approach is we're all religious. He was right. Now it but the maybe the causal factor of it is a different argument. Regardless, the dilemma is, as we become less religious or more secular as a society, that natural religion in us spills into the political sphere and we create a new religion of national politics. This is the genius of Jonathan Haidt.
Well, well, we're getting there. That's what Jonathan Haidt talks about. It
Yep.
is a religion now, and it's the others and us. That's
Yeah.
how they
Us
frame it.
versus them. Yes. So let me just make this statement because I don't want you to get in trouble with this. This is my opinion. So this is not, I'm not saying this is yours. I see no difference between AOC and Marjorie Taylor Greene. I see them as two halves of the same stupid coin because they're both prosecuting a false religious agenda politically and don't know it. And the person that can do the most damage is the person who is full of crap and doesn't know it because they can be sincere. Does that make sense? So I'm very concerned about the hard left, hard right. I want to get people
Oh,
back to that.
I'm definitely concerned with the hard left and the hard right. The only area that I would disagree with you on with the two of them is, I think Representative Ocasio-Cortez, I expected her to be much louder when she arrived in Congress in that wave election for Democratic women in particular. She, for the most part, she stayed in her lane, understanding that the speaker is the speaker, the Democratic leadership is the Democratic leadership. Even if she is outspoken on controversial issues, and she, I do think, identifies as the left wing of the Democratic Party. I think she's conducted herself a little bit better. Marjorie Taylor Greene, I am in agreement with you. She represents another extreme of one of the two political parties. But some of the things that I have heard her say, and the fact that she flew like a mock balloon inside of the Capitol when President Biden was going to speak, because they shot down the Chinese spy balloon over, I forgot where, in the United States. They eventually were shooting it down. That 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 was just a new level of absurdity. Like, there's certain, I agree, they're both members of the far right and far left in the political spectrum, but that just sometimes, when it turns into this,
Circus.
you're a circus. You're yelling at the president of the United States in the middle of his speech, whomever it is. I disagreed with it when Democrats did it to President Trump as well. I mean,
Yeah.
there's a little bit of quorum you must
Yeah.
maintain in the halls of Congress. But
Yep.
once they start doing that, and I've seen as Representative Marjorie Taylor Greene do that more often than most people in her own party, that's where I say, come on, man. Your constituents deserve better. They may have put you there, but don't embarrass them either.
Well, I think. Well, let me just look at them in the same camp, because I see them similarly, just for sake of argument. What I think the trouble is when we're electing activists, because activists are too busy making sure that they're right to actually be accurate. So they're so morally arrogant they skip over things. I know, because I was raised by them. I was raised by 5 activists, and one would do something. I'm the youngest of 7, and I used to do this thing where I used to sit around with like a mental notepad and just watch the older kids' behavior and go, okay, that's repeatable. That's pretty stupid. Don't do that. Stuff like that. And one of my oldest sisters, she would say in the kitchen, she would go, "It's like this," and like this bold, now, and I know is a virtue signaling statement, but she said it so emphatically. What she was then that statement would kind of rattle around the kitchen, and one of my other sisters would go, "Yeah, you're right," and then they all kind of acted like they had scientific consensus. And what I now know is, no, that's just a bold virtue signaling statement, and you're an idiot. So it's like, that wasn't about
Yeah,
being accurate. It was about proving which side of the argument they're on, which
right.
tribe they're on. It's tribal. So the what I like to see is, I like to see that push back on, saying, okay, as long as it's not the cost of everything. So what I'm very concerned about when I hear misguided activists say something like this: we need to do this at all costs. As soon as someone says something like that, you can rest assured they've never studied any of the costs. It's like, okay, well, how about humor me? Because the way I see this, Mike, is I see society on the road. It's like a car on the road to progress. Well, liberals are the gas pedal. They're trying to get us there as fast as possible, because they see the harm that the status quo commits against disenfranchised people, let's call it. All right, but the natural, rational response to someone saying we need to do this at all costs is to say, well, what are the costs? That's like tapping the brake. That's a conservative thought, because the conservatives trying to conserve the status quo. So all I say to my audience is, all right, so if we're a car on the road to progress, would you ever get into a car that didn't have a gas pedal or didn't have a brake? So we need both, and we need them both in
You mean
tension.
you need a centrism,
Yeah.
political centrism, political common sense. I couldn't agree more. I think it's in short supply
Well,
nowadays.
Well,
But
no longer, because we're gonna make sure that that's not the case. So what I want to do is I want to be able to bring. I can't wait to interview John McWhorter or Glenn Lowry or Greg Lukianoff or Jonathan Haidt, all these authors that need to be brought out into the front, because that's where we're going to get the truth from, especially the PhDs. Because my argument about that is, PhDs they're not allowed to lie to us. They can't even lie to us by accident. If they do, they can be defenestrated. It's the only talking head, the only position that can lose their actual credentials if they lie. So if we can get them on these shows and create a large enough audience that they would want to come on these shows and then interview them about what's ever going on in their field of expertise, I think we're going to be able to get to that truth.
Could you imagine if politicians had to act like PhDs when they sat in Congress? That would be some. I don't think I could cuss on this podcast, but that would be some crazy s. It would be really interesting. But yeah, I
I'm
agree.
looking
But
forward
also
to it, Mike. I'm
the
looking
the
forward to it because here's the
the
deal. What I think is going to happen here is you're going to bring us the world that's the finger on the button politically, and I'm going to bring it from an economic perspective. How do we leave this world a better place? That's what I see this as. Just, a little fountain of truth in a sea of lies. How do we minimize them?
and importantly, when you have experts like the PhDs and authors that you were mentioning, they teach us about how we think, and that's why we are the way that we are.
Yep.
So I think that's going to be critical for your audience. And then if they'd also like a breakdown of why the Dolphins are going to win the Super Bowl this year, I'm here for that too.
Well,
Um,
we're completely out of it, so why not you?
but yeah, no, I appreciate it, and yeah, I do think that there's a big benefit from uh, uh, being, as I said, more tolerant as young people, and then as you progress through your life and your careers, because that builds resilience, and that's what we need. We need to be more accepting of one another, whether it's in business and politics or just the neighbor down the street. So we got to. These are issues that need to be discussed more and more.
Well said, bro. I think that's a perfect place for us to end this. So next time we're going to have to discuss about what's the next book we're going to cover, or whatever comes up on your radar screen that's a news flash that we should cover then. Cool.
Yeah, but let me tell you, there's the story changes daily. There's breaking news. It's not going to take news isn't going to take a Christmas break, so there's going to be a lot coming over the next few weeks. But yeah,
I'm
looking forward to it, man.
looking forward to it, bro. Thanks for your time.
Thank you.